Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. Now usually in my videos at this point I'll tell you exactly what today's video is about, we'll go through all of the data that we're going to analyse, and then I'll wrap up with my summaries to what's going to happen over the next 3 to 6 months. But in today's video I wanted to do something a bit different, a bit more of a relaxed format. So I'm calling it a cup of Joe, which is the American phrase for a cup of coffee, obviously, because I've got a cup of coffee. Hopefully you have too. I've also got a glass of water, just in case I need a drink. There we go. And what I wanted to do really was just talk about some things that are going on generally around the world right now that will have an impact on the global economy, that probably don't merit a full deep dive video, or are things that are happening that you may not be aware of that I think is worth mentioning. So obviously the biggest thing that's happening right now is the war in Israel. On October the 7th, Hamas decided to invade Israel, and around 1,400 Israelis lost their lives, which was apparently the biggest single loss of life in one day since World War II. And as a result of that, Israel decided that it wanted to take action against Hamas to crush it. And so they've invaded the Gaza Strip. And the Gaza Strip is basically part of Israel. It's an area that's occupied predominantly by Palestinians. And this all dates back to World War II, when it was difficult to be able to break up who should live where. And so there was a lot of uncertainty as to what should happen. A war broke out between Israel and the Palestinians, and as a result of that, Israel took over the whole area. But since that time, Palestinians have lived in various pockets in Israel, and the Gaza Strip is the biggest one. And the problem that the global economy is facing here isn't that Israel is having a civil war, it's more the risk of somebody else getting involved. And the reason that there is a risk of that is that Iran have been backing Hamas for the last 30 years or so. They've reportedly provided around $100 million worth of support to Hamas. And so they're supporting Hamas, and the USA is standing very firmly behind Israel. And as a result of that position, Iran has started attacking US bases in Syria and Iraq. And as a result of that, the USA has now launched a couple of bombing campaigns against Iranian bases in the Middle East. And so we're starting to see tension rising between those two nations. And the Iranian foreign minister yesterday came out and said that he believes that it's inevitable that this war will spread and that more parties will become involved. So he's basically saying that they're going to get involved. And if Iran does directly get involved, it's very, very likely that the USA will oppose that. And it could be that we see things starting to escalate in the Middle East. Now, obviously, there have been wars in the Middle East previously. There was the Iraqi war at the beginning of this century that the USA sent a lot of troops to. But we haven't seen a major conflict since then. And it will be really interesting to see what does happen. Obviously, nobody wants another war. We don't want the USA to get actively involved. But there is a genuine risk that that could happen, particularly because Hamas aren't really fighting back against Israel. They're not really in a position to be able to do that. They don't have the strength in numbers. They don't have the artillery or the weaponry. If you've seen any of the footage, you'll see that the Gaza Strip is a complete wasteland at the moment. There has been mass bombing, and it really is going to take a massive effort to try to rebuild that area. So I think that's one of the biggest risks that are happening right now. But obviously, we've still got the war in Ukraine going on. And I do report about the financial implications on Russia on a regular basis. But the war is still happening more than 20 months after the initial invasion, which was back in February 2022. And this conflict is now almost like a permanent fixture. But Ukraine is trying to improve its position. And there have been a lot of talks recently about Ukraine joining the European Union. And interestingly, Hungary is really the only nation that's come out and said that they are opposed to that happening, because Hungary are still aligned relatively closely with Russia. And interestingly, the European Union is currently trying to vote through a $50 billion aid package for Ukraine. But it needs a unanimous vote. All 27 members of the EU have to vote in favour of that. And Hungary are likely to say no, because they already vetoed a previous proposal for $18 billion worth of aid earlier this year. And if that does happen, each individual country will then have to provide the support directly. So you'll have 26 individual aid packages put together, rather than there being a collective deal put together by the European Union. And I think it'll be really interesting if Ukraine does manage to join the EU, because in the same way as NATO, if it joins retrospectively whilst it's at war with Russia, it does raise the question as to what the EU would do about the war, whether or not they would become more actively involved, whether they would have to provide more financial support, whether they would have to provide any military support. All these questions remain unanswered. And I think it's probable that the EU would want to delay that membership because those questions would be so difficult to answer if Ukraine did become a full member of the European Union and was currently at war with Russia. Now, one of the negative implications of these wars is what's happening to oil prices. And immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we saw oil prices spike dramatically. However, over the course of the last year or so, we did see prices start to come down. However, OPEC Plus then decided that they wanted to start cutting supply to push price back up. So prices have been bouncing around a lot. And when Israel started its conflict, prices started to go up again. And we saw them hit a high of around $93 around 3 weeks ago. However, over the last 3 weeks, we've started to see the price coming back down again. And it's now sitting at around $81. So that's a significant movement against where we were 3 weeks ago. And the reason that it's come down is that everybody is now thinking that the slowdown in the global economy is going to outweigh any impact coming from these wars. So the overall sentiment right now is that everybody believes that we're going into a major slowdown over the next 6 to 12 months, partly as a result of all of these interest rate increases that were brought in over the last 12 months to try to bring inflation back down. Most countries have now got on top of inflation, but the knock-on implication of that is that raising the cost of borrowing has dampened demand and reduced people's appetite for debt, and therefore there is a slowdown globally in a lot of different economies. So there's always checks and balances in terms of what you do and what the knock-on implication of that. So as it sits at the moment, everybody's more concerned about a global slowdown than they are about war. However, if the war in Israel does start to escalate and other parties get involved, then the sentiment could change and we could become more worried about the war implications than we are about what's happening in the global economy. Now, in terms of what's happening in the UK economy, they've just released their GDP figures for quarter 3, and there's been celebration because they've had 0% growth, no growth whatsoever. And that's actually seen as being quite a good outcome because a lot of economists expected the UK to go into recession. They were expecting the quarterly result to be coming in as a negative figure. And actually, if you read between the lines and look at the detail, the actual result was 0.02 negative. But if you round that up to the nearest whole figure, it becomes 0. So everybody's saying, yes, it was 0. And I think it's really interesting that the press is saying that 0% growth is a good outcome for the UK. That's a good result. Everybody's happy with that because that's a terrible result. You know, if you've got 0% growth, then clearly you are very, very close to being in recession. Technically, you may not be in recession, but actually in reality, it shows what's happening in the economy. And things are not going well in the UK economy at the moment. And they're also not going well in the German economy. You may have seen the video that I posted just recently talking about the fact that they are definitely going into recession officially as at the end of 2023. Currently, they're in the same position as the UK. They managed to get 0% growth in one of their quarters, so they haven't had 2 consecutive falls in quarterly GDP, but it's only a matter of time before that happens. Now, another interesting thing that's happened in Europe this week is that the Portuguese Prime Minister has resigned. And he's done that as a result of the fact that one of his senior members of staff was arrested, and there is now a corruption investigation talking about lithium mines. Portugal has one of the biggest deposits of lithium in Europe, and there are some major questions being investigated right now as to who was given the contract for those mining deals. And as a result of that, the Prime Minister, who's been in power since 2015, so he's been there for 8 years, he's decided that he can't carry on and he's had to resign. And as a result of that, Portugal will have an election in March next year to appoint a new leader. So just thought I'd mention that because Portugal doesn't get a lot of coverage on the channel. It's a relatively small country, economically speaking, on a global perspective, but it's relatively important in the European economies. And then finally today I wanted to mention the fact that somebody has just had an eye transplant. For the first time ever, a full eye has been transplanted into a human being. And I'm quite surprised that it's taken this long for somebody to come up with the concept of an eye transplant. We've been doing heart transplants for a very long period of time. We've got an eye transplant now. And the question that I wanted to leave you with today is how long do you think it will be before somebody has a full head transplant? Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this new format. Maybe you haven't. Please let me know in the comments below whether you'd like to see more Cup of Joes or whether you just want this to be a one-off event. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed your coffee. I've enjoyed mine. Cheers.